Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody around the world. Thank you for joining this GMAT Club live session, another in the series of many live sessions that GMAT Club does, and another in the series that I've done with GMAT Club that we at Avanti Prep have done with GMAT Club. Today's session is going to focus on MBA recommendations, a variety of topics within that. We're going to take a deep dive into it, every kind of variable we can think of, from what your recommenders encounter, what questions they need to ask, what they need to rate you on. What's the experience like for your recommenders? What kind of portals do they need to navigate? How can you best select or best choose your recommenders? We'll go through details, a variety of variables for that, even some examples. And then, okay, once you know what they're going to encounter and who you've selected, how do you best prepare them? How should they tackle these questions? What should they focus on? So we'll go through all that, the whole kind of kit and caboodle. My name is Greg Guglielmo. I'm the founder of Avanti Prep. We are an MBA admissions consulting firm. We work with applicants all around the world and have, many, many years of experience now doing that. You could learn more on our website. Just very briefly to introduce us a little further and to see a little bit where recommendations fit into things. Just going to pull up, I'm sharing a screen. It sometimes takes a moment to pop up. Hello to India in the comment box. Feel free, by the way, over the course of the conversation today, to, comments and questions through GMAT Club. We'll get to those. We'll definitely save some time toward the end for those questions. As well as in YouTube, likes, comments, if you think it's deserving. I do try to go in and respond to those comments. So although this is a live session, even if you drop a comment in a week later, a month later, a year later, I do periodically take a look at those and will answer your questions there. So it almost can become a little bit of a forum specific to this topic, which again is MBA recommendations. Just very briefly up on the screen, I'm going to kind of toggle between a presentation and some windows today. This is a brief moment where we're going to pull up the Avanti Prep screen. Just so you're aware, we, like many firms, work with applicants over the course of their, it could be the entire application process. For many others, it's only different pieces of the application process. We work with applicants, the three main ways, I guess you could say we work with applicants are through workshops, hourly services, and packages. Workshops are 6 topic-specific sessions, each about 90 minutes long. We usually put, the same time and day on the calendar 6 weeks in a row and cover resumes 1 week, goals essays another week, personal essays another week, recommendations. So the topic, the topic we're covering today would be another week, and so on and so forth. And we'll just, live workshop your materials on those calls. Packages, as the name implies, would be much more comprehensive and almost all-encompassing. You can think of it, all the different steps from start to finish in your application process. Hourly services are flexible and fall somewhere in between. I mentioned them here today because, even if you weren't signing up for a package, recommendations are, I think, an overlooked part of what people can work on as an applicant, whether you're working with a consultant or not. They are an overlooked part of the process. A lot of people think, okay, I'm just going to ask my 2 recommenders to go ahead and run with these recommendations. But there's a process to this, and there's a process for you to manage and quarterback. We're going to go through the totality of that process today. I just wanted to point out that, whether through hourly services or woven into a package, recommender selection, recommendation strategy, recommender prep, not recommendation prep, recommender prep. How do we best enable you to best prepare your recommenders, to go through the questions, to brainstorm topics and specific examples that you hope they could highlight? These are all things that we engage with applicants on, and we do provide feedback to recommendations as well. You don't need to be and shouldn't even be a part of that, but recommenders will email us directly and we will provide polite and professional, but very specific feedback on recommendations. If we don't think they're hitting the mark, if they have, a lot of strengths, but no supporting examples, or if they're one dimensional, they only focus on one strength and one type of example, that's feedback we do provide. So just a few mentions there. We are offering a couple of discounts listed up here. We'll remind you of these toward the end of the presentation as well. That's 20% off of our discrete services with Morgan Bernstein. She's the former head of full-time MBA admissions at Berkeley Haas. So she spent about 12 years in admissions, 4 years running the whole team there at Haas. So opportunity to work directly with Morgan, 20% discount running. And we're also offering 1 free hour of founder service that's with me for every 4 hours of admissions head, that's Morgan, or senior consultant service in which you enroll. So enough of that. Let's dive into the recommendations. Good time, by the way, as this loads. Pretty good time right now for round 1 applicants to be thinking about this, to be thinking of all components of their applications, because it's July 18th and we're, less than 2 months from those early September deadlines for round 1 applicants. We're about 2 months from those mid-September deadlines. And we want to give your recommenders enough time to, as it says on the screen there, optimize their MBA recommendations, your MBA recommendations. Again, just fitting this into the macro scheme of what you're encountering as an applicant. This is a visual. It's almost, I just had on the screen a moment ago, some of the discrete kind of bulleted services that we provide to applicants. Whether we're working with you on those or not, those are the things, and these on the screen now are the things that you're going to be tackling through this process. Up on the top of the screen, this kind of goes top to bottom in terms of flow. Up on the top of the screen, there's some pre-application work and profile building work that you might do. We start clients off with an initial assessment. There's school selection. That's a kind of a questionnaire, the initial assessment. Developing your goals and your YMBA, developing your story. Then once we get into these middle pieces, I consider those kind of the execution pieces, the 4 pillars of execution in the application strategy. School research and engagement, essay brainstorming and reviews, or essay workshopping and reviews, resume workshopping and reviews, and here today, the focus, recommender selection, prep, and feedback. A few weeks ago, I did a presentation on school research and engagement, so that's been covered a year and 2 years ago, a video on essays. You can check those out on avantiprep.com under the blog and videos tab. But I think, again, just to reiterate, recommendations and their importance and their quality and the bar for a good recommendation, a really good recommendation. I think a lot of applicants, especially those who are new to this, which almost by definition everyone is, because you really kind of apply in 1 year, and that's just not like you're doing this year over year like we are. I think a lot of applicants and a lot of recommenders don't realize how strong these need to be, how specific these need to be, and how much can and probably should go into the process of thinking through and managing this. So that is why right there alongside essays, which we know is a huge part, this visual is not even really to scale. You could take essays and blow it even wider. We know that essays are a huge part of what you need to do as an applicant. We know that you need a really strong, usually 1-page resume for full-time MBA programs. But a lot of people, again, they don't really bucket recommendations under their own purview as an applicant. The ultimate submission, the ultimate creation of the recommendation is the purview of your recommenders, usually 2. We'll go through that. But the management of that process and the optimization of that process should be thought about under your purview and are, again, things that we do engage with applicants on. I alluded to some of this a moment ago, but here's a little bit of our agenda for today. What are my recommenders being asked to do? We'll look at the questions that they're going to encounter, and we'll allude to some variance between schools. How does the recommendation process work? Like, what am I actually toggling through, and fields and emails and portals, recommender portals? Your recommenders, again, are going to be the ones who ultimately receive those recommendation request emails and have to go into the portal to submit them. But it can help for you to at least have a visual or understand what that looks and feels like, so you can better explain it to them and characterize your ask. Who should I choose as my recommenders? That's a big topic. Recommender selection. Again, usually it's going to be 2 recommenders, and for some schools now it'll be 1. We'll talk through that. How can I prepare my recommenders to write the best possible recommendation? How should they tackle the first big question, which is a performance and strengths question? How should they tackle the feedback and response question, which is the other big question in there? And I've referenced some of this just a second ago, but these are rarely set it and forget it processes. I say rarely because, if you do work in an industry or a company where a certain manager writes 2 to 4 of these a year, they might get it. They might be like, all right, I got this. I do 2 to 4 of these a year. I know the bar. Maybe they went to a leading MBA program themselves. They understand the specificity, the bar for quality that goes into this. Maybe then it's like a little bit more set it or forget it. You kind of have to feel that out with them. But more often, and even with them, there can still be reason to prepare to attempt to optimize. These are not superficial, the applicant is smart and works hard letters. We need to go a lot deeper than that. I sometimes refer to them as the Dear John recommendations of the past. You think of, however many years ago, generations ago, looking at recommendation letters, the applicant is really smart and really hardworking and, will be an asset to your school, or they had to manage across different time zones and showed great skill. Those are so basic and such basic prerequisites. We need, and we will go through how to think about these things at a much deeper level, how to not just basic strengths, but real strong strengths, no pun intended, more differentiated strengths, more leading MBA type strengths than smart, hardworking, manage across time zones, to use those kind of cliches as an example. And recommendations, I don't want to add pressure or stress to what I'm sure is already a challenging process, but recommendations can make or break a result. So again, the bar here is high, the importance is high, and we don't want that importance to be overlooked. Part one is going to be those top 3 questions. What are my recommenders being asked to do? How does the recommendation process work? Who should I ask? All right, what are my recommenders being asked to do? And we'll go through a couple slides here, then we'll flip over to some examples as I like to do in these videos. Probably should have mentioned this earlier, but these videos, these are usually deep dives. We're going in, we're going to wrestle with the details. I will usually drop into the comments some sort of skip ahead, on the clock, on the YouTube clock, if you want to skip to a certain topic, because I understand that the video, if it runs 60 to 90 minutes, that's a lot to digest. But if you do want to sit there with a notebook, start brainstorming thoughts, hopefully that's what this is designed to do. It's not designed to be, a fluffy or overly entertaining. I hope it's mildly entertaining, but we want to wrestle with the content here. We want to wrestle with the process. And I want you to walk away really feeling like you are now immersed in understanding what this is. So that's our goal here. What are my recommenders being asked to do? Typically, they're going to be asked to submit around 10 to 15 ratings with you. So once they get that recommendation email and they open up, the portal to whatever school you're applying to, wherever you put their name down, they'll go into the recommendation portal. Most schools, but not all, will have some number of rankings or ratings for them to fill out across, a dozen different attributes or qualities. We'll look at what some of those are in a little bit. And then they'll have to answer and provide detailed written responses to the usually 4 questions that are written up on the page there. A shorter question about how they know you and your role in the organization. A longer question, kind of the first major question of substance. How does the performance of the applicant compare to that of other well-qualified individuals in similar roles? I.e., what are the applicant's principal strengths? That is usually up to 500 words. Some schools will cite a little bit of a lower target, like 300 or 350. We'll get into that in a little while. The second big question, you could say the third overall question, but the second big question of substance is describe the most important piece of constructive feedback you've given the applicant. Please detail the circumstances in the applicant's response. This also often allows up to 500 words. And then there's usually some sort of optional. Is there anything else we should know? Please be concise. Harvard will tell you, please be concise. If you're going to go there, we're going to talk about how to approach all these questions. But just so you have a baseline picture or understanding of What are they going to encounter? There you have it. There will be variance now. What I'm citing here are the main questions for most leading US MBA programs. Now, the LBSs of the world and the INSEADs of the world, the questions are similar, just sliced a little bit differently. They each have about 5 or 6 questions. The guts are kind of the same, but they'll be, maybe cut a little bit differently, or there'll be an extra little question that's different at the end. Some US programs, I've noted at the bottom, have kind of, I guess you could say, annoying for lack of a better term, but they do have an extra question, or they do word their questions a little bit differently. Kellogg asks an extra question about diversity. Stern asks an extra question about your EQ. Wharton and Sloan word their questions a little bit differently. Again, a lot of times the guts are the same. We'll talk about how to manage that process, but just so you know what they're encountering. Process-wise, there's, I guess you could say, a technical process here and a strategic process. The technical process is that wherever you decide to apply, you're going to go into your online application. You will have to enter a few fields, pick your recommenders, enter their name. Sometimes you'll have to say where they are current supervisor or direct supervisor, maybe a little bit of contact info. You'll definitely need to put their email address in. You should use professional email addresses, with very, very rare exception to that. Schools will even say it, some in a more pronounced way than others. But from a veracity and validity standpoint and credibility standpoint, we really, really want the professional email addresses in there. In a rare case, somebody retired or something, okay, cross that bridge when it comes, and they might explain in their recommendation why they couldn't, or you might in your optional essay explain, and then, I don't know, make them available, have them offer themselves up by phone, put their LinkedIn profile in there, anything to kind of buttress the validity, veracity, and credibility of the recommendation. Now, second bullet on the page, don't put their info in until you think they're ready to produce a strong recommendation. In other words, don't put their info in until, excuse me, you've talked with them, met with them, and managed this process to whatever degree you determine you're going to be able to manage it for that particular recommender. Why is that? And you'll even see some schools say, well, put their info in as soon as possible because you want them to give them as much time. But as soon as you put their info in, they can just go into the email they received from Tuck or Darden or Fuqua or Harvard or Wharton or wherever, and all of a sudden submit the recommendation. And I have seen that backfire a little bit. People, they have this grand plan to meet with their recommender 2 or 3 times to brainstorm potential strengths and themes and examples that they can, that their recommender can hopefully talk about, to basically go through the process that we're walking through today. They jump the gun on putting their recommender's contact info in. The recommender gets the email, and they're like, 2 hours later on a Sunday, the recommender has already submitted the recommendation, and they did it too fast, and they didn't know what was going into it, and that whole thing. So I would just be aware that if you want to manage this process and really optimize your recommendations by preparing and brainstorming and meeting with your recommenders, don't jump the gun on don't give them the ability to go a little rogue on you. It doesn't happen often, but I have seen it happen. And those are usually rushed recommendations, more superficial. The recommender wasn't fully aware of what needed to go into these. They will receive an automated email. They will submit ratings and written responses, as I mentioned, and we'll look at what a couple of those look like. The strategic process. Think, who could be your recommenders? You have a little bit of a flavor now, or a little bit of an idea of what goes into this, and we'll get even more deep into the weeds. But who do you know as former supervisors, maybe a former client, that would meet muster in terms of knowledge, depth? I've got it listed there on the second bullet. Who meets the criteria that we're going to look at on the next page for a recommender? Who is willing to provide the depth of insight, the time, who really, really has your back and is an ardent supporter of yours? What usually happens when we work with applicants, we send them our initial assessment questionnaire. The last section of that asks them to list anyone they think could be a recommender. We have 5 slots in there. Most people list, 3 or 4. options. And we'll talk through those. And you're sort of weighing these different variables. So prepare that short list. Think to yourself, and we'll look at the criteria and some of the other recommendations as to who these should be on the next slide. Once you've decided who they are, make your initial ask. It's usually kind of it might be a little stressful because now I have to tell my boss I'm going to leave. And there could be a little thought and stress that goes into that. That's usually a simpler ask though, or a shorter ask. Making your initial ask, are they willing to do it? Are they on board? When you make that initial ask, you could allude to, look, like here are the loosely allude perhaps to these are the questions you're going to encounter. This is the timeline. These are the deliverables. I usually think of the initial ask as kind of shorter. Are you willing to do it? Make sure they have some characterization or color on like what's going to go into this, but then define a process during that initial ask. Like make the initial ask. Would it be helpful then if we set up a meeting for next week to really sit down for, 30, 45, 60 minutes, whatever you can get on the recommender's calendar to really go through what goes into this. These are the 5 schools I'm applying to. These are their deadlines. 4 of them ask the same questions. This school happens to ask an extra question. So this is what they're going to be encountering. So start to think strategically, who could it be and what's this process going to look like with each of my recommenders? How can I quarterback it or manage it and give them the best chance, give your recommenders the best chance to succeed on your behalf? Who should you choose? Recommender selection, not a task to be rushed through, I think, not a task to be kind of, I'm just going to reach for my immediate, that immediate person because they know me really well. So read the instructions. Most schools still require 2 recommendations. Sometimes now schools only require 1. Occasionally you'll have a choice. Cornell Johnson requires 1, but allows a second. NYU Stern requires 1, but allows a second. INSEAD requires 2, but actually allows a third. Under no circumstances should you, exceed the maximum allowed. A lot of schools will even say that. Additional recommendations are neither like permitted nor encouraged. Some will even say they will hurt your candidacy. So, follow the rules on that. Schools will also have, and we'll pull up some examples of this, schools will have pretty good written pages around what they're looking for in a recommender. And I've summarized that in some of the subsequent bullets on this page. A lot of schools will say that ideally 1 should come from your current supervisor or manager. The most recent, it's your direct supervisor or manager. So they have a deep amount of insight into what you do on a day-to-day, week-to-week, project-to-project basis. At the same time, admissions committees will understand if you can't ask a current supervisor. That comes up. I have a common list of challenges toward the end of this presentation. We'll take questions from the crowd as well. Sometimes you can't ask your current supervisor. That's not really something to stress too much about. You can look at other very good options. We'll go through what some of those options are. Schools will give you the opportunity to explain that in the app. It'll usually either be a discrete text box in your application form where it says, if you did not choose your current recommender, please explain why. And it'll be a few sentences, 3 to 5 sentences thereabouts. Look out for word counts and character counts. Or it will be in the optional essay or additional information essay where they'll say, hey, if there's anything that needs explaining, including but not limited to choice of recommenders, describe it here. A second recommender, who could that be? Well, someone else who can evaluate your professional performance and your managerial or leadership potential, such as a former supervisor or a client. Former supervisors, like a classic example here would be current supervisor, former supervisor. But it doesn't have to be a former supervisor. If you are really, really involved in something outside of work, this is actually the next bullet on the page. A community leadership option can be considered as long as your involvement was significant and the individual managed you, was senior to you, and can speak to the qualities listed above. So think, you'll think, and we'll pull up some example, like kind of an example grid in just a sec. Let's actually just flip there right now. Here are examples actually of applicants we've worked with. I've got 8 examples on the page of recommender pairings. The classic one again at the top, current manager and previous manager. I don't know, you've worked for 4 years and you were in one role for 2 years and your current role for 2 years, well, that's kind of a classic pairing. The next two people on that page somebody had a current manager and a senior colleague in a nonprofit initiative. So this kind of fits that. If I can flip back, this fits that category. A community leadership option can be considered if your involvement was significant and the individual managed you. Well, this person, their involvement was significant. So really the second and third bullets here, who both have somebody classically professional, as well as then their second is this kind of non-professional. One is a complete nonprofit outside of work. The other was a company CSR initiative. The key here, though, is the applicant's involvement was really significant. And the person that wrote the recommendation was senior to them or managed them in those initiatives. But it can be a really cool combo when you have that level and degree of involvement. That level and degree of involvement, by the way, it becomes effectively professional. If you're that involved, yes, it's in the community, but you're leading initiatives, you're leading teams, you're managing projects, you're putting events together, whatever you're doing, they can provide really interesting insight. And again, the complementary nature then, a classically professional recommender and a kind of a nonprofit NGO CSR community leadership one is a cool option. The next person used two previous managers. Why'd they do that? Well, they had only recently joined their new firm and they felt like, all right, well, I've only been here a month. What can they really write about? Or maybe they joined a new firm and you don't want to burn bridges there. They just hired me. I just went through this big, long process. I can't tell them I'm leaving or planning to leave. Well, then we can certainly look at two previous managers. This person used a direct manager, somebody who was their direct manager until just recently. And then they used their manager's manager. Now, that one I'm going to highlight as well. That worked for this person because their manager's manager knew them really, really well. And even if the applicant technically reported directly to their direct manager, they still did a lot of stuff that the manager's manager, their skip level manager, if you want to call it that, was aware of and directly involved in. What you don't want to do here, and I would caution against, is pick a manager's manager when they only vaguely know you or you barely interact. That would even be kind of a red flag. You're going to end up with a vague or rushed or superficial recommendation. So you have to really tackle with the details here, tackle with the nuances associated with each recommender. Somebody else we worked with used their direct manager and an externship manager. They worked at consulting and went on a 6-month externship. Somebody else in consulting used an associate partner and a senior manager from two different client cases. So here in consulting, sometimes you might say, well, I don't know, I have like a direct performance manager, but they really just kind of staff me. They're not going to be as familiar with the nitty gritty of my work. Well, then look at look at who managed you on the actual client work. That's who's going to have the insight into your strengths and skills and areas for improvement and so forth. You might run into sometimes, and maybe we'll get the question later, somebody works in a family business or has their own business. What do I do then? That's a little tougher. You might think about a client of your business or your family business. And if you had a previous job in a corporate role, this is, again, a live example of somebody using, they worked for 2 years in a corporate job. Okay, let me use that manager. And then the last 2 or 3 years, they've had their own business or they went to a family business. I could use a client from that. So these pairings will vary for everybody. And you really have to wrestle with who it could be. Title or status does not matter. How, you don't want to go, I'm going to ask the CEO because that's going to look fancy. Well, have you ever met them? We want people who you've done really deep work. Like a lot of times the best recommenders are people who you work with daily and interact with daily. It doesn't have to be daily, certainly, but deeper, more specific, and we'll see why when we get into these questions. We don't want, listed at the bottom of the page, academic references or professors. You don't want your peer, your buddy, and you don't want family members if you work at, if you work at a family business. This academic reference or professor one, I get more questions about it than I sort of think I should. I feel like even a cursory read of, go to the application website for the school to which you're applying and look at their descriptions. We're going to pull a couple up in a second. They will usually explicitly say, do not use academic references. These are professional or almost professional, real kind of leadership in the weeds, how you manage, how you work, what your strengths are as a working, post-undergrad professional if you're applying to these kind of classic full-time MBA programs. Another big layer in who you should choose, and I've alluded to it, is depth. Like and here's how Haas and Stanford, just as examples, characterize this. So we know some of the qualifications of who we should pick from the previous page, but what about the stuff? Somebody might check all those boxes, tick all those boxes of they were a direct supervisor and they did work with me day to day. But if you look what I've got highlighted here in yellow, I don't get that feeling that they really have my back, or I don't get the feeling that they would really put time into this. That could, so they might check the boxes, they might fit the profile like on its face, but when you dig deeper into whether they would be well positioned and enthused and willing and able to dedicate the time to write you a really strong recommendation, they might not meet that muster. Again, from Haas, the title or status of those you select is not important. What does matter is how closely they have worked with you and whether they can describe in detail, I added that in for emphasis, your value as an employee, professional accomplishments and personal qualities, and interpersonal skills in an organizational context. From Stanford, you should choose individuals who know you well through significant direct involvement with you, will provide detailed anecdotes and examples to support their assertions, and are sufficiently enthused to spend time writing a thoughtful letter. Tuck has a version of this up on their website. They basically ask these in 3 questions and say, do they have the knowledge? Do they have the willingness? Do they have the time? And if the answer to any of these questions is no, you should pick somebody else or really think about picking somebody else. At the bottom of the page there, if you have a few options, consider how they complement each other. I pointed at a couple of examples here. For people who have something really robust that's like community leadership, that could be an interesting combination. Or even if you're choosing between employer, like traditional professional options, if there are like 2 people from your current job, but they're going to talk about the same things, maybe you should look at somebody from a previous role then, as long as it's not, say, too far back. So you really have to triangulate all these different variables. It's like a calculus almost of all these different variables. And again, a lot of times you throw those first 3-4 names down on the page and can iterate and brainstorm between those. Let's change screens and pull up some of the examples that I've been mentioning here, just to bring this to life. And I know it takes a little more time to do this, but I think it does help to bring it to life, to bring it to kind of like school specific life. So all right. So we're going to pull up just like the recommender instruction pages for a few schools: Harvard, Stanford, Tuck, and Cornell Johnson. So you go to any, this is Harvard's page. You go to any kind of front. These are publicly available pages. You don't need to have started an application in order to view them. Here's Harvard's version of it. You will need to have 2 recommendations submitted online by the application deadlines. It's your responsibility to make sure it's submitted. Use your best judgment on who to ask. There is no set formula. We know it's not possible to always have a direct supervisor. We wouldn't want you to jeopardize your current position for the application process. Look at the questions like we just did. Find people who know you well enough to answer them. And then they offer you some possible suggestions. I would be a little bit this wording of colleague, like really peer. Don't read that as peer. I would almost interpret it more as like, okay, it's not my formal supervisor, but it's somebody I reported to on a really big project. That kind of seniority and management and oversight of you don't want to ask, your fellow analyst or associate who you're buddies with and go to drinks. So I think that would undermine the quality and you to be a detriment to your application. And they allude as well, how well a person knows you takes priority over level of seniority or alumni status. I mean, if you have like two people who are equally able and one happens to be an alum of the school, maybe the tie goes to the alum in that situation. But if the alum is like, I don't really know them that well, I'm kind of forcing an alum into this, don't force an alum in there. And you're going to be applying to several schools anyway. You're not going to have an alum for every school. Alum's almost like more a happy accident when it happens. Stanford has, I think, one of the better recommender description pages here. It's really detailed. We don't have to go through every line on here. But they start to give you like really granular advice. This can be good even if you're not applying to Stanford. It's almost like nice to pull up and take a look at. They offer suggestions as to who that first recommender could be, current direct supervisor or next best alternative. But what happens if you can't do that? And they list some examples, common, examples of why you might not be able to. Second recommendation, someone else who has supervised you. So they're kind of hearkening back to that idea that, it doesn't have to be like my direct supervisor, but it should be somebody who supervised me, oversaw, I reported to, even if it's not my direct manager, but I did a project for this person, or they run the NGO that I was super involved in. That sort of thing. So, and you could keep on kind of scrolling down to see more about the traits and competencies and such that they ask. We'll look at different versions of that. Here's Tuck. One reason I like that, again, even if you're not applying to Tuck has really good blog posts about all the different components of their application. So even if you're not, applying to Tuck, maybe you'll read this and you'll decide to apply to Tuck. They call them references. You'll see a little bit of, Stern calls them EQ endorsers. These are all recommenders ultimately. They have a really good blog post. Pull that up, read that. You've got the questions in the middle of the page that I mentioned a moment ago. Once you've identified who you would like to write for you, ask them these 3 questions, or ask yourself these 3 questions. Do they have the knowledge of my outcomes and behavior to write a compelling LOR? Do they have the desire to write a positive LOR, letter of recommendation? Do they have the time to write a detailed LOR? If the answer to any of these questions is no, find somebody else. So feel free to read through that. Here is Cornell. 1 letter of recommendation is required, but you may submit up to 2 for review by the committee. Now, more often than not, you're applying to several schools, and many or most of those schools are going to require 2. You probably have a second person on deck. I think in that case, if it's a value add and you think strong recommendation, which we hope after this process it will be, I would say submit 2. Can't really think of a scenario unless somebody thought their second one was bad or something. But I would think go for 2. They do mention, Cornell mentions here, the GMAC common letter of recommendation. The common LOR is something that schools adopted and try to build around. It basically includes the 4 questions that I pulled up on the screen before. Technically speaking, for schools that, and you could pull up the list, Google GMAC, GMAC, common letter of recommendation, you'll be able to see the list of schools that purport to use it or say they use it. Many schools do build around these questions, but I find that even schools that say they use it still sometimes ask an extra question or have a little bit of a quirk in there. So technically it's designed to make things easier on your recommenders. And technically it's designed so that they could just write this once in this document and upload it to various schools. There might be instances like Cornell saying that's okay. But I think if you take a more granular look at things, schools have little quirks in the way they ask for ratings or don't ask for ratings or vary which ratings they ask for. They might have an extra question. They might have a little bit of a different word count. So it's kind of hard to use this exact PDF, but just so you know, if you see that referenced, that is what it's referring to. Now, what do your recommenders actually encounter? So they will get an email. You'll put their name in finally. You think they're prepared and ready to go. You don't think they're going to jump the gun. You put their email in, and they put their email address in, ideally their professional email address. They get an automated email from the school. Some are kind of skinny and, direct, like such and such an applicant asked you for a recommendation, follow this link and submit it by the deadline. Others are a little more instructive and will remind them like what makes a good recommendation. We're waiting for this screen to load. While we wait for that to load, let's see if there's any questions. Okay, it has loaded. We'll come back to questions later. This is hard. So your recommender got the email. This is Harvard example. They get the link, and now they're into the portal. Well, in the portal, they're going to have to list their organization, their position, how they know you. Harvard asks, and you'll run into some of these quirks. Harvard asks that context question. It was the 50-word question from before. They ask it in a text box, and they limit the recommender to 300 characters for it. I think Stanford limits them to 320 characters. So there are, just like you as an applicant, you will have to tangle with these different kind of portals and systems and such. Harvard has a whole array of attributes that they need to rate you across. They do remind recommenders, look, if you give somebody all like the highest ratings, it doesn't sound credible. It doesn't sound real. So they should read the instructions for all of these. And Harvard in this case is recommending that they distribute the ratings across the whole grid accordingly. By the way, this stuff, some schools will even kind of PDF this so that it's accessible and viewable. Stanford has a PDF of these attributes. So it's not like we're like, these aren't anything that's surprising or hidden or secret. It's just so you're aware of what they're encountering. Harvard will also require them to use this space up to 500 characters to elaborate on the leadership ratings that they've assigned above and the skill ratings that they've assigned down here. And then toward the bottom, they will upload their written recommendation. You'll note things to variable areas here. Some schools will require an upload, as Harvard does. Other schools will have one text box per question. Other schools will have one giant text box. This is Chicago Booth. They have a skills assessment as well. It's a little bit different, and you can see the different variables there. They also require an upload. You'll note that they don't ask the optional question at the end, and they don't actually ask that first question, how do you know the applicant? Well, all right, if I'm a recommender and I'm writing a recommendation for someone and I'm filling out 5 or 6 of these recommendations, and 4 or almost all of them, or all of them except one, ask me to kind of like introduce myself and say how I know the applicant. I've known them for 2 years. I was a, senior vice president of such and such a group. I was involved in hiring and subsequently managing applicant X. Through that interaction, we, interacted on a deep level every day, whatever that kind of introductory to. Even though Booth is not asking that question, every other school is. It would only be natural, I think, in an uploaded recommendation to include that context. Would be kind of weird, I think, without it. So just because they don't write a page about that, but like 2 sentences to just context set can be helpful. This is Kellogg. Kellogg, like Harvard, wants to know about your interaction with the applicant and how you know them, or how they know you, how the recommender knows you, the applicant, in a text box, 250 characters. They also ask this extra question: what has been the candidate's most significant contribution to your organization? They then fill out a leadership assessment, and they upload their recommendation or can paste their document in here. I mentioned extra questions or different questions. Kellogg is unique with this question. That's an extra question that Kellogg asks. NYU Stern has an extra question as well. So you kind of have to know, if you're applying to these schools and you're sitting down with your recommenders, they're going to have those main questions that are similar or the same across schools. But if I'm applying to a Stern or a Kellogg, just make them aware in advance so that when they kind of put together that, maybe that first master draft of your recommendation, Kellogg's going to ask that diversity question, and NYU Stern is going to ask this question about emotional intelligence. And again, these aren't like government secrets or school secrets. They list these questions up on the front page of the application requirements and explain what all goes into them. Columbia does not ask for ratings, so they just want the written recommendation. Like Booth, they don't ask that introductory how do you know them question, but you're uploading a PDF, of up to 1,000 words, usually about 500 per main question. It would be weird for a recommender to write a recommendation and not context set or not say how they know you or how long and in what capacity. That should go at the start of it. Tuck does not ask for ratings either. They just have, and you can see here, one big box for them to paste. We saw Stern had, a box per question. Tuck's got one big box. Haas has kind of the classic or common LOR, 12 ratings. This is actually good to look at. A lot of these other ones had drop downs, and when I click on the drop downs, you can't see what the options are. But a lot of schools will have some sort of overall ranking or rating. So they'll ask the recommender to rank you or rate you across 12 variables. But then they'll also ask the recommender to give 2 kind of overall rankings or ratings. And you could see them here because Haas has these radio buttons for them to choose. Based on your professional experience, how do you rate this applicant compared to his or her peer group? You can see the options there. Overall, I do not recommend, recommend with reservations, recommend, or enthusiastically recommend. I mean, ideally here, you are choosing people, and ideally you're the type of candidate who, through the pattern of your work and habits and strengths and such, has people who will be enthusiastically recommending you, and we hope that they would pick that. But again, you don't want, like with those previous ratings, somebody who just scatterbrain chooses because they're rushing through it. They just thoughtlessly choose all the highest ratings or something, and it doesn't seem realistic or doesn't match with what they then provide in the down bottom here. That would feel discordant. Haas, by the way, had an extra question about confidence with humility, which your recommenders had to tackle. Confidence without attitude, one of the 4 defining principles for Haas, but they've gotten rid of it this year, so it should be a little bit easier on your recommenders. Kellogg and Stern still have those extra questions. All right, so call that part 1. I know we've covered a good amount of time already, but again, this is designed to be like a deep dive tutorial. I will chapterize it down in the comments, so you can just skip ahead to different parts, rather than watching it for too long, or watch it on 2x speed or something. But I really want this to be like soup to nuts, full on deep dive tutorial across schools, across different dimensions, the totality of the recommendation process. Let's go back to our presentation. All right, so you understand what the questions are and what your recommenders are being asked to do. You understand how to select your recommenders, how to choose them, maybe a little bit about how to navigate some sticky situations, and we could revisit some of those. Now, how should you prepare your recommenders? What about the content now that and the actual written deliverable that's going to go into this? So you made the initial ask. Now set up a first meeting or call. I use the word initial here again, but really here I'm meaning like you already asked them, and now let's sit down. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about it with a little more detail. Go through the process timeline and questions with them. You might have alluded when you first asked them. You might have said, look, it's 4 or 5 questions per school. I'm applying to 5 schools. The deadlines are in September and early October. You might have been a little more vague with it, just for like the 5 minutes you were mentioning to them and, ask them if they'd be willing. Now you're actually going to sit down and think through the substance. Like, what's the project? What's the timeline? What's the process? You got to be a little careful, I guess, giving your boss deadlines, but maybe like a little bit of that. What would be most helpful to them? Could you, in that meeting, you also have to adjust this, by the way, you got to kind of like know your audience. It's just like anything at work. If you're asking somebody who is super busy, or going on vacation, or I don't know, some managers prefer bullets in an email, really brief. Other managers are more like feedback oriented. I remember back when I applied, I mean, it was over 10 years ago, I was going through this process now, but one of my recommenders used it as like a real kind of feedback process, almost like a glorified, really detailed. So we met a few times and he really, shared verbally. He didn't share his recommendation with me, but he shared verbally what he thought were my strengths and examples that supported them. And he shared verbally what he thought areas for improvement were. So you kind of have to gauge that, like figure out what the right cadence is for who you're asking and where they're located. Are you in an office with them and you share a floor and their door is always open and you have a lot of time, to connect? Are they, I don't know, are they in New York and you're in Asia? Well, that, maybe you set up one call. So you have to figure out, am I going to get like, do I sit down with them 2 times here? Is it just 1 time? Are they even willing to talk to me? Do I have to kind of accomplish this all through email? If it is through email, how succinct, concise do I need to be? That kind of thing. Manage their expectations. I have a couple bullets in here. Avoid under articulating what this ask is. It does take some time to do this well, for them to do this well. You saw all those questions that Stanford and Tuck asks to like verify and vet whether people should be your recommenders. So don't under articulate the ask, but don't over articulate it either. A lot of these questions are the same or similar. You could almost think of it as one, or potentially even frame it, not to the point that you're diminishing the ask or making it seem simpler than it is, but you could almost think of it as one master recommendation that my recommender needs to submit 5 times. There has to be maybe a little bit of adaptation. Wharton asks slightly different questions. Sloan, starting this year, unfortunately, now asks slightly different questions. I think it just adds to recommenders' plate when schools do that, but it is what it is. But you could almost think of it. So once you know where you're applying, look at the recommendation questions for those schools. You could almost build a matrix. I'll show you an example of a matrix in a little bit. You could almost build a question matrix, and you're going to see that like there's like 80-90% overlap a lot of times. Then they might need that extra question for Kellogg or that extra question for Stern, or to kind of reframe or reallocate or make sure they're answering specific questions that Wharton and Sloan or MIT Sloan are asking. But there's a way to kind of boil it down to its essence and make your recommender feel like, I want to get my master recommendation, my kind of all-encompassing recommendation, really, really, really strong. And then I'm going to distribute that or submit that or adapt it a little bit if needed, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, depending on where you're applying. Ask your recommender if it would be helpful for you to put together a prep document, kind of like a highlight reel. I mean, your project, just like going into a year-end performance review. You're going to put together your highlight reel. You're going to put together bullets or short or sentences or short paragraphs about what you want to remind your manager you've done and worked on. You were the one kind of on the ground in the nitty gritty doing it. Even if they know you really well, they might not realize or recognize everything that went into it. So there's an opportunity if they are open to it. That's why there's a question mark at the end. You got to, again, have to tailor that. What exactly a recommender wants is going to vary by recommender. You're not writing the recommendation for them. You are highlighting themes and examples or ideas that you hope they might consider or strongly consider when they go and craft their recommendation. And again, that prep document, it could vary from, I don't want one, no, I got it, I do this all the time, I got it covered, to yes, just give me some skinny bullets in an email, to like a 1 or 2 page highlight reel. And it really depends. You have to, again, know your audience and calibrate to that. And final bullet on the page, if you can, set up a subsequent meeting to call or check in and discuss further with your recommenders. There again, you got to calibrate. Like, are you only going to get 1 meeting with them? Okay, got to cover kind of it all in that. Or maybe if it's 2 meetings, they could be a few weeks apart. The first one can be like where you walk through what's ahead and what the questions are and what the schools are and what the schools are looking for. brainstorm some ideas. Maybe a couple weeks later, or coming out of that meeting, you share a prep doc with them, or you have a subsequent meeting where you sit down and go through, things you were hoping they would cover, that kind of process. I just pulled this up really quick. These are the questions, again, that we looked at the beginning, what they're being asked to do. We're going to go through the specific questions now, focusing primarily on these two kind of master substance questions. These are the guts. Like we saw Booth and Columbia only ask these two questions. They don't even ask an optional one. They don't ask the this question that precedes it. Oops. But just very quickly, again, those 50 words: provide a brief description of your interaction with the applicant and, if applicable, the applicant's role in your organization. Just remember to context set. Like, we want from those 50 words to be able to place, the admissions committee wants to be able to place in their brain, who is this recommender? Who are you? How do you interact? For how long? In what role? What do you work on? I would say it's only 50 words and it's only context setting, but that can be important and can kind of clarify, so that when they step into the guts, these two yellow questions, when they step into the guts of that, they know what they're stepping into. It's kind of situation setting and clarity and such. Again, Columbia and Booth don't explicitly ask for those, but they're doing it for every other school. It would almost be weird if they didn't include something like that. It doesn't have to have a question header if they don't have, but just like almost like an introduction to the recommendation. This is who I am. This is how I know the applicant. This is what the applicant does in my organization. This is what we work on. This is how long I've managed her. And Kellogg, Stanford, Harvard asked for this question up in a text box with finite character counts. So, a lot of details. That first question, performance and strengths. How should they tackle this question? What I have on the page here is just like a starting point for thinking and conversing about this. So let's look at the question here. How does the performance of the applicant compare to that of other well-qualified individuals in similar roles? This, for whatever reason, will usually say, e.g., what are the applicant's principal strengths? I think that I almost feel like performance and strengths are like a little bit different. They're related, but I usually think of it as the performance and strengths question. School's exact wording of this could vary ever so slightly. How do we want to think about this? Let's recall what the Stanfords and such of the world were reminding us. Know you well through significant direct involvement. Will provide detailed anecdotes and examples to support their assertions. Are sufficiently enthused to spend time writing a thoughtful letter. This is from Tuck, by the way. When Tuck emails recommenders, they remind them a strong reference. Look at that middle paragraph. A strong reference demonstrates your knowledge of the applicant's qualifications for admission and supports those qualifications with descriptive examples, stories, and anecdotes. General language, even when highly positive, lacks helpful context. So, how do we want to tackle performance and strengths? Often they'll have, up to 500 words with this, even if it's 400, even if it's a little lower. Let's think about this in buckets. I like, where possible, to have some sort of paragraph, or I would encourage recommenders to have some sort of paragraph that does speak explicitly to performance, provided your performance is strong and high and is going to accrue to your benefit by including specific references to it. What could this include? It could include rankings, ratings, promotions, awards. It could include qualitative descriptions of your performance. For example, rankings, ratings. If they were your manager for 3 years, worked in financial services, completed a 3-year analyst program, you had the same manager for 2 or 3 of those years, they did your year-end review 2 or 3 times, you were rated out of 5 and you received the highest rating all 3 years, and only 10% of analysts received that rating, and even smaller percentage received that rating 3 years in a row, that would be awesome to say. If they have managed over 200 analysts over the course of their 15-year career in financial services, and they think you are in the top 5 of those 200, they should say stuff like that. That is quantifiable and sharp and credible and objective even. I mean, even if it's coming through kind of like the subjective lens of your recommender, it is kind of, these are stats that you earned in a competitive corporation. They should mention who they're comparing you against. In that case, it was, analysts at your financial services organization. I just alluded to a little bit of context too. That person mentioned, maybe they didn't mention it earlier, but they've, maybe they're an executive director or senior vice president with 15 years of experience at financial services firm X. Over the course of my 15 years of experience, I've managed, like I said, 200. Like, they're setting context that adds to the reader's knowledge of their vantage point and the credibility of that vantage point. And you're ranking very highly within that. If you received certain promotions or awards, they might mention them in this kind of performance area. There could also be these other kind of qualitative performance descriptions, meaning, I don't know, if you got selected above peers to lead a certain project that they were building. They had to pick one analyst in the, Chicago office to lead this, and they chose you out of however many people. Why did they choose you? So something that how does look at the first half of the question. How does the performance of the applicant compare to that of other well-qualified individuals in similar roles? Answer that. Find ways to answer that. There'll be different nuggets of information in here for different people. Now, if your rankings and ratings are not that great, okay, if they have your back and are trying to do you a favor, they might not mention those, or they might use, like, I don't know, maybe they think you're awesome, but like for whatever reason, you only got a 3 out of 5 in that rating thing. Well, they should probably focus more on how awesome they think you are and why they think that, and not say, well, you only got an average rating in your performance review. They should use in that case, their ranking, rating, opinion of you. So you're trying to figure out what would accrue to your benefit, what arrows are in the quiver from a performance perspective that could go into, let's say, a paragraph like this. Now, don't stop there. This question is huge. Which is why I don't understand why it's sometimes in parentheses for certain schools. What are the applicant's principal strengths? Let's think in buckets here. We don't want what I mentioned a long time ago in the beginning of this conversation, where they say, well, the applicant is smart and hardworking and they managed to cross different time zones once. So basic. Everyone applying is smart and hardworking, and managing across time zones is a matter of looking up different, what time it is in one country versus the other. We got to go deeper than that. And we got to go multidimensional. So not just basic strengths. We need MBA level, top tier MBA level, more interesting strengths. We'll look at examples of that in a second. And we want to be multidimensional with that. That's why I encourage people to start. You don't have to use this paragraph construct where you have like a performance paragraph and then 3 strengths, each supported by an example. But it's an idea. It's a starting point for brainstorming. And the idea behind, I'm going to focus on 3 strengths, is to be multidimensional with it. Don't just focus on brains and smarts and modeling and Excel. Even that, by the way, if it's something like that is a category, it should be superior to just that. How do you use it? How do you use it to creative problem solve, to innovate, to creatively problem solve or innovate? And then let's look at other dimensions. So what are 3 different and top tier MBA level, more advanced quality, strength, skills, or themes that they can focus on? And very importantly, what are the supporting examples that demonstrate that strength or quality or skill or theme? Like picking the themes or strengths is important, but from like a written perspective for your recommender, it's almost kind of like the first sentence of this paragraph or this paragraph or this paragraph. The rest of the sentence is the example that supports or illustrate, or examples that support and illustrate the strength that they are articulating. We saw Tuck say it. We saw Stanford say it. Everybody says it. Everybody thinks it. We don't just want strength. We don't want basic strengths. We want real differentiated strengths. We don't just want real differentiated strengths. We need them to be supported with concrete, specific examples. This is where the work comes in. There's thought, there's strategy, and your recommender needs to ideally articulate these examples to illustrate the strengths. One way for them to think about that is the old tried and true STAR approach: situation, task, action, result. Or you'll hear SAR, situation, action, result. You'll hear SOAR, situation, obstacle, action, result. Whatever it is, some sort of structure like that for them to articulate an engine example, a defining example for each strength that they're referencing. We need that in there. Don't just say what the example was. We want them to articulate the how. How did you do it? Not what did you do? Well, what did you do? But also, how did you do it? How uniquely did you do it? What steps were involved? And we want them to convey the impact. Maybe that impact is quantifiable. That would be great if they could quantify it. It brings that example to life. Sometimes the impact is more qualitative. They could still, convey that as well. Something maybe a little more intangible. It changed the culture of the organization, or the level of investment and mentorship between senior analysts and junior analysts. Maybe the example they're sharing is you started some intern manager program. You served as the intern manager. You started some mentorship program. So that's a potential structure and some very, very strong, not just reminders, but like blueprint. Now, you don't want your they don't have to follow this. Blueprint's maybe too strong of a word. You don't follow this to a T. That might be too much. They should run with this. They should run with this. They should make it theirs. But make sure you imbue upon them. They should adopt their own style and structure. It might even look weird if both of your recommenders have, similar structures, but imbue upon them the importance of going beyond basic strengths and having specific engine examples that illustrate each of these strengths that they focus on. When I say go beyond basic strengths, this is just like a raw menu brain dump of examples. Again, I use that kind of tongue-in-cheek reference of, the applicant's really smart and hardworking and manage across time zones. That would be like 3 strengths, but they're so basic. We need to go beyond that. MBA programs are thinking about you as a person, as a leader, as a team member, as somebody who can influence, as somebody who can influence without authority, as somebody who could bring people together. You'll see some of their questions like MIT Sloan this year, new questions for recommenders got even a little more targeted with some of this stuff. So go beyond the basics. Are there different areas here? It's almost a menu. Obviously, they can't just cherry pick from the menu, and it has to be true to you. But hopefully, a list like this can inspire thought and conversation with your recommenders as to what they might be able to focus on. And if you are using this starting point of let me brainstorm 2 or 3 or 4 strengths or strength areas that I hope my recommender can run with, and an example, of course, to support each of those 2 or 3 or 4 strengths, you might look on a page like this. You'll also see, by the way, a lot of these are interconnected. It's like you're not just picking one term or phrase from this. This is of our own design. Just over the years and kind of a brain dump. You could almost, by the way, apply this to you could take these same themes, think of these, have this document in front of you when you work on your resume bullets. Which of these themes is each of my resume bullets highlighting? You could think of this when you think of different examples to share in interviews, behavioral questions. Tell me about a time when you resolved a conflict, overcame a challenge, worked in a diverse team. It's kind of like anecdote building in line with these more advanced and top tier MBA relevant examples. I was going to say, you're not just cherry picking one off of here. A lot of them will kind of overlap. It's almost a nexus. Those 3 kind of overlap. Some of these might overlap. Some of these might overlap. So it's not like you're cherry picking and on and on and on. You're not I have to grab one of these terms or phrases and I'm running with that. It's more like where do you belong? What are three pockets of strength or pockets of strong examples on a list like this? Not comprehensive, not exhaustive either. There might be others out there. What are the three pockets here? And like, once you identify 2 or 3 or 4 of those pockets, hopefully your recommenders will run with those thoughts and have examples, concrete and specific examples to share that illustrate them. Examples are key. I mentioned before, by the way, look, like if there could be something in here about your quantitative and analytical ability, but do you even need that? If it's obvious from the work you do and your stats and your scores and your GPA, the recommendations might be an opportunity, probably is an opportunity for your recommender to focus on these other more leadership-y and more impactful elements that kind of transcend just analytical ability and which, might not be obvious. Now, if you are somebody who comes from like a non-quant background and you need to, have a recommender hopefully buttress your quant and analytical ability through a recommendation, maybe one of the strengths they highlight should orient around quant and analytical ability. But even then, I've got it there in parentheses, not at a basic she's smart level. We need to show differentiation. Do you use that quant and analytical ability to anticipate scenarios, to creatively problem solve, to innovate or create new things? Did you use it to ask the right questions or mentor others? Like, think beyond the basic, encourage your recommenders to think beyond the basic. And again, think of how these different, not only how the recommenders at a macro level, if there's 2 of them, complement one another, but how what each of them talks about could, look, if you sit down with them and you brainstorm and you offer suggestions, you don't ultimately know what they're going to do and run with, but at least from a kind of conversational standpoint, and again, imbuing upon them that they need to go beyond the basics and they need to have specific examples. Support your qualifications with descriptive examples, stories, and anecdotes. This again from Tuck's email to recommenders. Good segue here, by the way, to the next big question. A strong reference also highlights your growth areas. That is a segue to the next big question, that other often 500-word question. That other big question is, please describe the most important piece of constructive feedback you've given the applicant. Please detail the circumstances and the applicant's response. So here, important, not to ignore this question. It's not an accident that this question has the same or similar word count as the first main question. For Kellogg, I think it's 50 words shorter as a target or something. But this is a real question. Don't ignore it. The other thing, don't ignore the question at a macro level. Don't ignore the response aspect of this. What's the most important piece of constructive feedback? Please detail the circumstances and the applicant's response. So a potential construct or a way, and these could definitely vary, and they are hard sometimes for recommenders to think of or for you to brainstorm with your recommenders. You're trying to come up with something, but they should be honest and insightful. We don't want, here the tongue-in-cheek kind of bad example would be, the applicant wasn't very good at PowerPoint when they first joined the team. That's so basic. That's so non-insightful. The other end of the spectrum, by the way, to avoid would be like something that completely sinks your candidacy. The applicant only works well alone and is terrible at working with others, and I had to give them feedback about that. Okay, that's too much maybe. Hopefully you've heard that feedback before and are working on that and have worked on that. That's a little too much. They should offer a genuine insight in here. What was the constructive feedback? What led to the recommenders giving you this feedback? In what context was it delivered? Was it after a certain client meeting? Was it during your quarterly performance reviews, annual performance reviews? What was your response in the moment? How did you receive the feedback? What qualities did you exhibit in doing so? Perhaps with more substance, what was your response over time? Was this a year ago, and over the last year, you have really internalized and taken specific steps to improve in that area? Let's hear about those steps. This will show how you've taken feedback and grown from it. It doesn't mean it's perfect yet. Maybe it's still a growth area, may well be still a growth area or an area for you to improve when you're in the MBA program. Maybe they could even say that, how they think you can continue to grow when you're in the MBA program. Has your growth had a positive impact? What does this show about the applicant? So absolutely, not to be ignored. Think through this in detail. It is, I think, admittedly a little harder sometimes for recommenders and applicants to come up with, but genuine insight here is definitely welcome. Let's flip off. We're going to go to questions in a moment. If you don't mind me dancing around another screen. This document that I've just pulled up is it's like the beginnings of a potential recommender prep document. If you are going to put together like a one-pager for your recommenders to kind of introduce them to what's in front of them and to, potentially brainstorm out some of the strengths and examples you hope they could think about. What you see at the top here, and you can kind of fill in your name, fill in the name of the recommender. What you see at the top here, stylize this, summarize it, however you think. This is just an example. What you see at the top here is just a random sample of 10 schools. It is a grid, though. I mentioned much earlier in the conversation, trying to navigate what are the similarities and differences between the recommender questions that are asked by school. And this grid attempts to summarize or highlight. I know it's a little tough to figure out what it says if you're not familiar with, what all goes into this. But here's 10 schools. There's their deadline. I actually put the day of the week in there because, once you get down to like those final weeks, making sure your recommender knows like, hey, September 6th is next Wednesday. It's the Monday. It's 2 days after Labor Day in the U.S., which is a holiday here. So, days, however you want to kind of format that. Are they going to ask for ratings? Harvard asks for 19 ratings and then requires comments within it. Columbia and Tuck do not ask for ratings. A lot of the rest of the schools ask for pretty similar ratings. We looked at examples of those before, and if you're just joining this section of the call, I will eventually put in the comments a way where you could kind of skip ahead to these different parts of the presentation. These are the 4 kind of main questions that are asked. There's that 50-word, usually 50-word, how do you know the applicant question? There's that big performance and strengths question. There's that big feedback and response question. And then some schools will ask an optional question. You'll see a little bit of variance in length. Many or most give you about 500 words for these. I mentioned earlier that Harvard, Stanford, and Kellogg ask for this in a tight box that's governed by character count with spaces. So your recommenders will have to do a little bit of what you have to do on the application side and right size things for those. Columbia articulates a total word count of 1,000 words. Booth uses the 1 to 3 page metric. Most of these are 500 words. Some are a little bit shorter, and so on and so forth. And then you'll have a different delivery method for different schools. Some of them will ask recommenders to paste text into those boxes that we looked at. Others will ask them to upload a PDF. Some will give them a choice. And then you have that occasional extra question or two. Sloan, again, slightly different questions. Wharton, rather, different questions as well. And then down in like the guts of the document, it's basically what I had on the slides. That's where you might brainstorm bullets or whatever you think would most prepare or acclimate your recommenders with examples, strengths, themes you hope they can highlight. Really themes, so each supported by an example or examples. What did I have here? These are basically, okay, just some examples. I mentioned Wharton has different questions. These are them. You can find them right on the page, right on Wharton's application page. MIT, where are we? MIT Sloan, 1 letter of recommendation now. And here are their questions. You could see, again, like the gut, even when the questions vary, The guts of these questions are still kind of bark up the same tree, so to speak, as the other ones. These are a little more targeted, though. They're kind of telling you the examples they want to hear now. Kellogg, we already saw their extra question. Stern, we already saw their extra question. Here's LBS. So it's just a little highlighting a little bit of the variance that exists. Here's LBS's questions. You could see, again, they all kind of, they're in the same orbit, but they get broken out a little bit. So like here they're asking for weaknesses or areas of improvement. It's actually plural, whereas the US schools, it's, you know, the most important piece of constructive feedback and the applicant's response. It's really kind of the main or most juicy or most interesting. So there's like a little bit of a nuance difference there. Key strengths is separated as a question for LBS from that performance question, whereas a lot of the US schools merge those together. And then this is a question that's distinct for LBS. What do you think you'd be doing in 10 years' time? So just put a little bit of a punchline on that and then go to questions. If you are applying to 5 schools, determine what the recommender questions are for those schools. Great if they're all the same. If you have an LBS in the mix, if you have a Kellogg in the mix with an extra question or an NYU Stern in the mix, or an MIT, like you'll have to customize a little bit, but still, I think your recommender should feel like they have to create one master, really, really good recommendation, and then just make sure they're hitting those other questions. If you wanted to get it, if your recommender is willing to get into like hyper school specific tailoring, great. I think ultimately that is hard to find among recommenders. Just think of the amount of time that will go into that. But great if they do. Great if you can highlight, school specific attributes. Cynically and candidly, I would say a lot of these schools, even if they brand it differently, they're kind of looking for the same themes and qualities. So like one that, helps you one place, it's not going to like hurt you another place. That is not a statement meant to be interpreted as like on your own application or your own essays. You do really need to tailor those to schools, but recommenders, I mean, the degree of tailoring and the level or expectation of like hyper-specific school tailoring is not quite as much there. Evidence in the fact that many schools have a, shared in that common LOR or share the same questions. Now, again, you might have those certain schools. Haas used to ask a specific question about one of their 4 defining principles. Kellogg asks the diversity question. Stern asks their EQ, IQ question. Sloan asks their new array of questions. So just make sure you grapple with all of that. Let's turn it back for your questions. All right. I have some common questions up on the page, but let's just see what we hit of these in the next 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, so we have some questions unrelated to recommendations. Is the NGO in which I am a team leader good enough? Just basing it off of what I see in that tiny little question, if you're a leader of an NGO, that sounds like it would be good enough and there would be enough substance there. If you're a team leader, I guess you're leading a certain team, you probably have a boss or a manager. Who is that boss or manager? Can they write you a recommendation? I feel like that probably would, and I'd love to hear more about it, but I feel like that would meet muster. Should it be other more experienced team leaders who have guided me or the authority of the NGO? A follow-up question to what we just mentioned. Probably the former. So if I'm interpreting the question, it sounds like you could ask like other team leaders, people senior to you, or the person who's maybe the founder or head of the NGO. If you know the founder or head and you have done direct work for them and they have deep and specific insight and can tackle all the different things we highlighted in here, then I think they are a viable option. But if they don't, and they're kind of, you only know them on paper, or maybe you met for 5 seconds at an event one time, then no, you should not ask them. You should ask one of these like more experienced team leaders or managers. What about business partners? In the case of a family business, it's funny that we're working with somebody in a situation just like this right now. I would lean more toward a client than a business partner. A business partner feels almost like too much of an embedded peer with you. I mean, it's not, even if it's not a family business and even if it's not a family member, it's just like, ooh, is that person's like your colleague, your co-head, your co-founder, your co-whatever? I mean, you got to look at your whole array of options. And if you didn't have other good ones, maybe you look there. But that one feels kind of guilty until proven innocent to me. I would probably lean, if I were, had my own business, or I were in a family business, I would probably look at like a client, and I'd probably want like a senior, we did XYZ for such and such a client, and we worked directly with the, chief information officer, chief strategy officer. Like, as long as you had direct, the title's not important. It's really who but somebody, it shouldn't be like the junior person that you dealt with. I think it would be like the client, almost like somebody who has credibility and can almost stand in for a supervisor. They supervised you, but they were your client. You got to make sure though that there's the depth of knowledge, and that again they can kind of cover everything that has been covered in this presentation. Let's just look at some other common questions. I can't ask my current supervisor or employer. Maybe you just joined. And you've only managed for a month or something. Well, then certainly that is very understandable and even rational and better to go with somebody who was a previous manager and could provide more substance. As I mentioned a long time ago in this presentation, you'll have an opportunity in the application, either in a text box, a specific text box that asks why you haven't used your current supervisor, or in an optional essay, you'll have an opportunity to explain why you haven't done that, and just give your honest rationale. I've only been there a month. They don't know me that well. Therefore, I felt that previous supervisor X could highlight ABC and previous supervisor Y could, speak to my original work in such and such a role. I work at a family business or as an entrepreneur. We just talked about that. My direct supervisor doesn't put time into things like this. This is where you get into those murkier, you kind of have to ask yourself those questions that Tuck encourages you to ask, those questions that Stanford encourages you to ask. It's not just, do they meet the criteria as my direct supervisor? It's, are they enthused and willing, and can they put in the time? And are they going to really grapple with what needs to go into this? If you have a manager who feels like they are, I don't know, a curmudgeon, maybe even generationally, they just don't really senior, and they're not like a big writer or computer user, like some of those dynamics. I guess that's increasingly rare now, but that's like, you got to kind of weigh those. Like, you don't want somebody who's just going to be like, yeah, I'll do it, and then they spend 20 minutes doing it. I've actually seen that submarine. I've seen that sink candidacies or be a big hole in candidacies. Get a call from an applicant that they thought they had, really senior person on board, and they put the person's email in, and they got notice 20 minutes later that the manager submitted the recommendation. How could a manager deliver quality in 20 minutes? It takes 10 minutes just to fill out the text and the ratings in the thing. How could they spend 10 minutes writing a few sentences? You saw what goes into, or check back in this presentation to see what goes into quality recommendations. So I think that if you have a direct supervisor who does not put time into things like this, or there's other alarm bells about how much they like you, how enthused they are about you, how enthused they are about you going to an MBA. Do they think MBAs are a waste of time? You got to kind of sniff out that negative energy, or those things that are going to limit the quality of the recommendation. I think that would be disqualifying for a direct supervisor. You have to look at other alternatives and, explain why you chose them. I don't think you'd say, you wouldn't say my manager doesn't like me, that's why I chose somebody else. You wouldn't say they're, a negative person. That's why you wouldn't say those things. You might just highlight instead why you chose the others, not why you didn't choose your current manager. I can ask an alum, but they don't know me that well. Self-explanatory. We covered it earlier. No, don't force an alum in here. They need to know you well. Rank, title, status, alumni status does not matter. It's how well they know you. I used the example earlier, though. If you have like 2 equal choices and one is an alum, go with the alum for that school. I think that's a nice touch. I don't have the ability to meet with my recommenders. We covered this in the how to manage this process section of the presentation. You got to tailor that. You have to tailor your approach to that. Again, know the style, know your audience, know if your recommender, they might love you and be super enthused to do this, but they just aren't going to be able to meet with you. And they say, yeah, send me a few bullets and I'll run with it. And you trust them. And that's cool. That's fine. You might have another recommender who is like, yeah, I'd love to use this as a opportunity to share what I really think about your performance over the last few years. And, I'd love to hear about, what these schools are looking for and when it's due, and, put together a 1-page highlight reel for me like you would before your year-end performance review. So you just have to tailor to your audience. The important thing is that you think that they are enthused, have the time, know you well enough to share specific examples. My recommender does not speak English. This can happen. Read the instructions for your school super carefully. They will tell you what to do. It usually amounts to, and sometimes you have to open the application and go to the recommendation section to see the detailed instructions about this. Often it amounts to them having to get it translated. Some schools will want both the English translated copy and the original. They're behind it. They should use a professional translating service. You're not allowed to translate that yourself. Do not submit extra letters of recommendation. Follow the rules. They don't want an extra. Like if they say 2 and they say, do not send us an extra one, do not send them an extra one. But do consider letters of support. This is a whole kind of adjacent and also maybe not always known category. Booth has something lurking on their website called Shape the Class. That's where alumni or students or people involved with Booth, if they know you as an applicant really well, maybe not well enough as a recommender would, they don't, they're not a good fit to serve as a recommender. I mean, heck, if they're a current student, certainly they wouldn't. They could submit a Shape the Class for you. Duke Fuqua is another school that has a formal portal for this, where current students, alumni, people affiliated with Duke Fuqua's MBA program can submit kind of an endorsement on behalf of an applicant. These are usually shorter than regular recommendations. The person should know you well. Don't force those. You can't just, I talked to a certain current student for 30 minutes and hey, can you write me an endorsement? You should really former colleague, former classmate, think through those lenses, and they should really offer substance and really be selective with those. Where schools don't have a formal portal for that, oftentimes, an email to a certain admissions contact. They could if they're a current student, they could pop into the admissions office and ask what, if any, would be the most appropriate way to do that. So let's leave it there. That is a lot, but I think, again, it's intentionally a lot. I like for these to be, they kind of always hover around this 90-minute mark, tutorials where you can, play it on 2x and just think through. If you're new to this, go through the whole thing, digest the whole thing. I hope now that you have a feel for the process and the depth that goes into this and the thought that can go into it. Some notes up on the screen there. Check us out on the web, avantiprep.com. Hit like, subscribe, comment. I'll reply to the comments. I will put those skip ahead links in there. We are running a couple of discounts as well. You can save 20% on story and strategy and read and review services with Morgan Bernstein, the former head of full-time MBA admissions at Berkeley Haas. Obviously, her expertise transcends just Haas. So that deal is running right now, as well as a deal to receive 1 hour of free founder service for every 4 hours that you sign up, either with Morgan, the former admissions head, or with one of our senior consultants. So sign up for a free consultation. We are kind of approaching that runway now into round one deadlines. So it's July 18th. We're like 8 weeks. It kind of depends on your school a little bit, 8 to 10 weeks. You got to be on this stuff. And we, would certainly welcome the opportunity to work with you on any part or parcel of the process from, a lot of it or most of it, all the way down to discrete elements of it, just resume reviews or essay reviews or recommender selection and strategy, recommender prep, recommendation feedback, interview prep later on, maybe waitlist support, scholarship negotiations, any and all of the above. So thank you for joining today. It's always great to have you here. We hope that this helped you, and we look forward to seeing you next time.